So I thought I'd do something that could be slightly fun and record myself writing part of a passage. Now, why did I decide to do this? Well, I saw another author mention in an authors group that he does this and uploads it to YouTube, and there are people who seem to want to watch it for some reason. And I thought, well, that sounds like fun. I might do that. And so I decided to record myself for about 10 minutes, 10 or 15 minutes, when I'm writing a passage in the Daros Chronicles, Volume 2. Now, I'm currently writing the first draft, so that's one thing I want to say up front that this is first draft material, okay? So you're going to see it in all its glory as I write my first crack at something. The second thing I want to say is that I will correct things, move backwards and correct things. Now, you may have heard some writers or read in some articles the advice that, you know what, when you write the first draft, give yourself permission to write crap. Don't go back and edit, it's just going to slow you down. Turn off Microsoft Word spell check and everything else so you're not distracted by the red squiggly lines, and go ahead and just let vomit onto the page. Just write shit. All first drafts are shit. Well, I've tried that and it doesn't work for me. I've tried not editing, and what it does is it really kills my creative process because I have the type of brain that keeps track of the errors that I've made. Unconsciously in the back of my mind, there'll be a little speed bump that goes up for every error I make. Oh, that's the fourth typo you've made and haven't corrected. And if I don't correct as I go along, these things add up, and eventually I just can't think anymore because my brain's too cluttered with all these speed bumps. So it works much better for me if I just edit as I go along. I mean, after all, it's not a race. So who cares if it slows me down? It's not a race. And for when you're writing, you have to figure out what works for you. Apart from the advice that all writers must write, I mean, everything else is up for grabs. And just because you may have read an article that says, Stephen King writes in this particular way, doesn't mean it's going to work for you, and it doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to work for me. So I have tried the let yourself write crap method and it doesn't work. I've got the t-shirt on that one. And the only reason I'm mentioning this is to, stop anybody from emailing me or commenting or whatever and saying, you know what, Sarah, you should really not correct your mistakes as you go. You should just write crap. As I said, tried it, done it, got the t-shirt, doesn't work for me. This works for me much better. So with that in mind, I'll advance the video. Now you're going to see here in the beginning that the cursor is blinking for a little bit. And the reason for that is I find the first line or two of each scene is the most difficult part of the scene to write. Not all the time, but a lot of the time. And the reason for that is I'm what's called a discovery or writer or pantser or organic writer or whatever. And that means I don't do a lot of outlining up front. Sometimes I don't do any. And essentially that means I make up the story as I go along. And because of that, when I'm starting a new scene, it could be a scene that just popped into my head like 5 seconds ago. I finished the old scene and I'm like, oh, you know what? Now that I've written this last scene, I think I'm going to write this next scene as something that I just dreamed up based on the last scene. And so I haven't given it any forethought. For example, whose point of view am I going to write it in? Where is it going to be set? Any of that stuff. And so this is where I'm going to be doing that. Now, in this particular scene, I wanted to choose something that wasn't going to be spoilerish because it is Daros Volume 2. And so I chose to record myself when I'm writing a scene in Eric's viewpoint, Eric the Spy Master. I didn't want to do it in Aaron's head or Fee's head or Avere's head because any scene I would have written would have been spoilerish because I mean the story has moved on since the end of Daros Volume 1. So the reason I chose Eric was there's nothing in what you're going to see that's going to really give anything away. So with that in mind, let's continue. So you can see what I mean about the first line or two about a scene being the most difficult for me. I mean, it's really common for me to write a sentence or two or three or even a paragraph and then go, ah, no, 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 that's not quite what I'm looking for, and go back and try again. I actually considered cutting that whole beginning part of the video until I actually, really got going. And I thought, no, no, I'll keep it in because, then you can actually see my writing process rather than a cleaned up writing process, which, wouldn't really be representative of what I do. Now, here you'll see that I started out a sentence saying, normally, these people had been tasked, and then I went back and I modify it to but he tasked these people, ferrets, whatever. um, and the reason I did that was because the first sentence was a passive sentence. Rather than it said the people had been tasked, so it was emphasizing the object, and it wasn't making it clear who had tasked them. I mean, we could guess that it was Eric from the context, but it didn't say that. And most of the time, not all of the time, but most of the time, it's better to write an active sentence over a passive one. So that's why I changed it to, but he tasked them. Now, you'll, again, getting back to writing advice, you'll read a lot of writing advice about how writing in the passive voice is horrible and you should never do it and everything else. Well, once again, as with most things in life, better to do things in moderation. Sometimes the passive voice sounds better depending on the sentence, and other times it's the form you want to use because you actually want to emphasize the object, not the subject. But I would say 7 to 8 times out of 10, if you have the choice between the passive form or the active form, you want to go with the active form. And that was certainly the case here, which is why I went back and changed it. Yeah, as I said up front, this is a first draft, and that sentence is really badly worded, so that will definitely be changed. And there are a few other things I can see that I'll likely change. Watching this, you may think I'm a painfully slow writer. I'm not really. I can write about 750 to 1,000 words an hour when I really get going. This scene, I hadn't given any thought to whatsoever, and it's actually the first scene in the second volume with Eric. So it wasn't sort of continuing anything that had already taken place in the second volume, and that's why I'm essentially making this up as I go along. I mean, that's true for everything, but in this scene in particular, absolutely no forethought, hadn't thought about it, hadn't already held several conversations in my mind that I could write down, nothing like that. And so that's why this scene, probably I'm writing a little slower than I usually do. Um, Maybe later on in the book, I'll record another scene, or I'll record another scene of something else I'm writing. Excuse me, when I know that I'm going to be writing something that I'm going to be able to go a lot faster, so you can see the difference. Yeah, so if you're wondering, what I just wrote was 302 words. And time of the recording is almost 14 minutes long. So I wrote 302 words in 14 minutes. So, multiply 302 by 4, and you'll see that you get 1,200 and something words. So it looks like I'm writing really slowly. But in fact, at that pace, I would end up with something like, let me just pull up my calculator here. I'm at my computer. So 302 times 4 is, okay, 1,208 words. So if I kept up at that pace, I and did it for an hour, I'd produce, 1,208 words, which is not too shabby at all. A lot of writers are pleased if they can write 500 words. And sometimes it does take me longer, and other times much shorter. It depends on the scene I'm writing, the character I'm writing, how much thought I've already given to the scene, and a bunch of other factors. So that's it. That's me writing a scene. I bet that was really exciting, right? And like I said, maybe I'll record myself writing another scene later in this book, or maybe I'll record myself writing a scene in something else that I'm writing. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this, or at least found it interesting.